Good evening, folks. Welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am one of your co-hosts, Sam Whitfield, broadcasting live. For those of you who are a bit confused, I just want to clarify real quick. Usually we stream this podcast over on American Watchman's channel, but seeing as how I forgot the password because it didn't save into my password saver thing, and I didn't have time to dig it up. I just decided it would be easiest to do it from this channel. Without further ado, I'll let my other two co-hosts introduce themselves, starting with Josh, and then yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joshua Johnson, and I'm a Russian bot.
Hey everybody, I'm Gabe Icaboni.
And well, Mr. Russian Bot, I suppose it's your show tonight. So lay us out. What are we going to be talking about tonight?
Well, for the first half of the program, we're going to be discussing the incident that occurred in the Kerch Strait around the Crimean Peninsula. And then for the second half of the program, we're going to be discussing the new trade deal that the United States, Canada, and Mexico signed, along with, I believe, if correct me if I'm wrong, Gabe, a little bit of news on the trade war front with China.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so moving ahead with what happened in Ukraine, I will briefly lay out the facts for our listeners of what happened, and then we'll go ahead and we'll break it down a little bit. So this past week, a little bit of backstory, everybody should know by now that Crimea was annexed into Russia following a referendum there in 2014, and is now part of the Russian Federation, although that is not recognized by the United States or Ukraine or much of the European Union. And that basically gets us to where we are today in terms of why this is seen as controversial. But three Ukrainian warships decided that they would enter into Russian territorial waters around the Kerch Strait near the peninsula, and that they would approach the Crimean coastline and dock at the old naval ports they were used to docking in. And obviously that wasn't going to fly with Russian military personnel on the ground, so they decided that they would open fire on the ships, and then they captured the ships and all of the sailors on board, who are now in Russian custody. Obviously, Ukraine wasn't too happy about this, and they have since begun the process of declaring martial law. Their President Poroshenko has, which seems a little odd, but we'll get more into the background on that as we discuss this, in order to just keep this briefing short and sweet. And now that the Ukrainian government has begun the process of entering martial law, and Russia is holding their sailors and ships on the peninsula, the United States has come out swinging, saying that Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine and the European Union tend to agree with them. I don't, as you might have already guessed from my introduction. I guess that's where we're at. I know I left a lot out, but I'm hoping we can kind of cover it in the questions that are asked. I'm kind of trying to leave a little bit for you guys, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess I'll go ahead and ask. I mean, I this is supposed to be one question, but I suppose it's kind of two questions in one. The first question I would have is, why is Russia always seen as like the boogeyman in these situations? Because it seems like every time I hear of Russia doing something, the New York Times always prints something along the lines of this could lead to possible war with Russia, and
Well, a lot of the times, what happens, you usually see this with United States fighters or naval ships, is we'll pass into waters or airspace that is claimed by the Russian Federation, and they will respond by telling us to leave or threatening to shoot us down. Of course, nobody wants to start a third world war, so they usually don't shoot us down, but what ends up happening is you have a Russian fighter jet that flies uncomfortably close to an F-22 Raptor or whatever the case may be. Sometimes you have Russian naval ships that sail right up on top of American warships in that case. In this particular case, as I mentioned, the problem is this. So, as I mentioned, Ukraine does not recognize the results of the 2014 referendum, which was held in Crimea. And but what that essentially means is that they don't. If you were to go to a Ukrainian school, right, their map is still going to show the Crimean Peninsula as being part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Whereas in Russian schools, it's going to show it as part of the Russian Federation. But the problem with not recognizing the peninsula as being Russian, with not recognizing, you may not recognize the legitimacy of that referendum. That's your opinion. But that doesn't change the reality that there are Russian military personnel on the ground, and they have the ability to enforce their claim on the peninsula. So if you go ahead and take 3 warships and sail them into waters that Russia claims as its own and has the power to enforce as its own, don't be surprised when you get shot at. So it's ironic in my view, or maybe that's not the word. It's sort of dishonest how the media has portrayed Russia as being the aggressor in this case when Ukraine sailed their ships into Russian territorial waters.
So back up for the audience at home real quick, because obviously we're all foreign policy wonks to a certain extent. But what was that 2014 referendum that you mentioned? I think
so. It's a long story. A long time ago, to make it as short as I can, the Crimean Peninsula had been part of Russia. It was populated by ethnic Russians, but in the 1960s, before the 1960s, Stalin began moving Russians as part of population transfers. He began moving ethnic Russians all throughout the Soviet Union, including and especially into Crimea. In the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea over. So within the Soviet Union, you had different SFSRs, which were Soviet Federal Socialist Republics.
Right.
And there was the RSFSR, which was Russia. Then there was the Ukrainian SFSR. It's a tongue twister.
Yeah.
And Nikita Khrushchev gave the Crimean Peninsula from the Russian one to the Ukrainian one. And the reasoning behind this was to try and please Ukrainian nationalists who were within that SFSR. Nationalism was a problem within the Soviet Union throughout its entire existence. It's part of why it broke up so quickly in the end, because when the central government began to look weak, all the different nationalist groups began coming out saying they wanted to be their own country. But in the 60s, Khrushchev kind of appeased them by making Crimea part of their SFSR. Flash forward now to 2010, the Ukrainian presidential election that saw Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted in 2014, elected as president. I forget the name of his political party now. I believe it was the Party of Nations. Came out, and they were the pro-Russian party, and they had their most popular support in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, and in Crimea, where the majority of people were ethnically Russian as a result of the aforementioned population transfers. And they spoke Russian. They viewed themselves as Russian. They voted for Yanukovych and his party. Crimea, if I remember correctly, actually had an upwards of 85% result for Yanukovych. And that election was deemed free and fair by the United States, the United Nations, and the EU. You can still go find a bunch of Washington Post articles calling it a free and fair election. So that shows you where the sympathies of the people on the ground are. That's important for when we come to the 2014 referendum, which the U.S. now suddenly claims was not a fair or free referendum, even though in 2010 all of the people voting for a clearly pro-Russian position was free and fair. So now, 2014, Viktor Yanukovych is overthrown in the Maidan protests, which were spurred on by the European Union because they wanted to have a gas deal with Ukraine. Russia did not want the deal. Yanukovych didn't want the deal because it would have reoriented Ukraine into the EU's economic sphere. It would have helped them further integrate. And so the Maidan protesters, when Yanukovych comes out and says he's not going to sign this deal, they began protesting in the streets, and then things got pretty violent thereafter because the government was not going to budge on this. And so Yanukovych gets toppled in February or March of 2014. A few short weeks later, initially unidentified. They were wearing military uniforms, but there was no identification as to what country they were on them. Troops began coming into Ukraine. They were being airdropped. They were being brought in on the beaches. They were later revealed to be Russian troops who were moving in as a result of the chaos and anarchy that had begun to spread throughout the country with the collapse of Yanukovych's government. Meanwhile, the radicals who overthrew him were spending their time, what's the word I'm looking for, cementing their grip on power in Kiev. So the eastern and southern part of the country in Crimea were starting to break off. People were freaked out. The president they voted for overwhelmingly in 2010 had been ousted in an illegal coup. They did not recognize the new government in Kiev. And so you began seeing in Donbas the rebel groups that are now fighting against the Ukrainian government breaking off. And in Kiev, in Crimea, you saw direct intervention by Russian troops. And that has historical, as I mentioned before, historical precedent, seeing that that had been part of Russia. And the majority of people there were ethnic Russians. By the end of the year, I can't remember the exact month, they held a referendum in Crimea. The people voted overwhelmingly to become part of the Russian Federation. They didn't want to go and be their own independent little republic like we see the people in Donbas doing right now. And that's how Crimea became part of the Russian Federation. Now, as I mentioned, the U.S. and Crimea and Ukraine don't recognize that referendum result. They say it wasn't free and fair. But as I mentioned, that doesn't really stack up with the math when you look at the way that region has historically been voting in elections that we had said were free and fair up until it suddenly was inconvenient to keep saying that for us.
I see.
That was as short as I can make it.
Yeah, no, I know. A lot. That's a lot to go through. I do think it's important to kind of establish some of the backstory on this. So I guess I don't know. Well, Gabe, do you have any questions you want to ask?
I don't. I mean, that's about the extent of the history I understand of the situation. Crimea. I mean, I take a even further historical perspective than Josh, maybe a little bit, in that the Crimea historically has been a region that's been fought over for many years. But like Josh said, during the Soviet Union and during Russia's tenure, a lot of ethnic Russians were brought into Crimea. And so when Putin went into Crimea, a lot of the populace welcomed him, which was interesting because the perspective from the West and the perspective from Ukraine was that Crimea was being invaded, when many Crimeans who had been in the country for a couple of generations felt like they were being liberated by Russia. So you kind of had the West having their perspective on it and portraying it in a certain way to Western minds, whereas the people of Crimea felt very differently than their supposed liberators.
I'm actually kind of amazed everybody agrees with me on this one for once. But
Yeah.
it's kind of a cut and dried affair, and it comes down to the sort of Russophobic, as we've discussed before, the Russophobic elite in Washington, who act as though Russia cannot have its own sphere in Eastern Europe, even though historically that's never been the case.
Well, so that would be my second question, especially since we're on my my YouTube channel talking to, presumably I do see that we have a few of my regular viewers watching. So hello to you guys. I think I can speak for a lot of people when I'm going to kind of play devil's, I don't want to say play devil's advocate, but that's the best term I can think of. Josh, why should we care? Does this even have anything to do with America? Why are we even talking about this?
In my opinion, and I think the majority of America First or average American voters would agree with me, it really isn't our business, because put it this way, we would say that Mexico is probably in our sphere, right? They're in our backyard. So let's go ahead and say that it's not quite the same because there's not the ethnic history. So maybe I'm picking a bad example. You know, they weren't all we weren't in the same country as Mexico at one time, like Russia and Ukraine were.
Right, but it's the closest thing we
The
have.
point, the point is, would we really care if Russia began telling us how we ought to be handling our relationship with Mexico, like we do them in Ukraine, or would we appreciate it? Using Cuba during the missile crisis, that's in our backyard too. Would we appreciate it if Russian warships came in and began sailing around waters in Cuba or in Mexico? We wouldn't appreciate it too much. It's right in our backyard. It's more of our interest than theirs. So Americans don't really have a stake in this fight. However, big business does have a stake in this fight. The European Union certainly has a stake in this fight because they want to get their hands on the, as I mentioned before, what this all started over was an energy deal, a pipeline deal, determining who was going to supply Ukraine with all the energy it needed. Was it going to continue to be Russia, or were they going to sign a deal that would further integrate them with the European Union? The EU would ultimately like to see Ukraine become a member state. That was what I believe Timoshenko, who had actually been Yanukovych's opponent in 2010, that's what her election campaign platform had been: closer ties with the West. We talk about having a divided country here, but if you look at the election results for Ukraine in the years leading up to 2014, it was even worse than it was in America, and that is, as we've discussed, partially the culture deal. And so you can see why, as Gabe and I sort of discussed, why the people in Crimea and in the Donbas region either welcomed Russia as liberators, or in Donbas decided to break off and establish their own semi-autonomous, backed by Russia, little republics. Because it would be the equivalent of, say, Donald Trump is overthrown tomorrow and Hillary Clinton comes in as the president. There would be quite a few people in the Midwest and the South and the Rust Belt who would probably not recognize or feel safe with that new government because that's not what they had voted for.
So, bottom line, to kind of, I don't know if I'm oversimplifying your point here, but just to kind of boil it down, essentially, you're saying that this really isn't any of America's business, but that big government and big corporations are essentially
The elites have a profit-driven interest in getting Ukraine into the European Union and into the Western sphere. I would note, if for any of our viewers, because I wanted to mention this as well, for any of our viewers or listeners who are wondering why Ukraine would decide, because obviously nobody here thinks that Ukraine could win. I hope nobody thinks that Ukraine could win a war with Russia. So the question might be, well, even if they don't recognize the referendum, why be so stupid as to pull this little stunt and send 3 of their ships in? I mentioned earlier they're declaring martial law. Ukraine has a presidential election this next year. And the man who has taken over following Yanukovych's ouster, Petro Poroshenko, he's been doing absolutely terrible in the polls. And this isn't just a Russian talking point. This is something you can find in the BBC, you can find it in Yahoo, you can find it in the New York Times. For months now, if you've been following the Ukrainian presidential election, he's been heading towards a landslide loss. So it's mighty convenient that just because 3 ships have been captured from the Navy and the sailors have been captured, that he gets to go ahead and say the country is under threat and they need to declare martial law and conveniently cancel the elections that are coming up, which he's not projected to do too well in. So that's another factor people need to be aware of.
Okay, yeah. That I think that factor certainly, that is an important fact to mention. I actually did not know that part of it. So yeah, I could certainly see how that's a bummer. I guess my last question on this particular topic, and then unless Gabe has anything, we can move on. My last topic, um, is this an event that could cause like World War III? I hate to be overly dramatic, but like as I said a few minutes ago, it always feels like anytime Russia is mentioned, the Western media at least is always, saying something like, "Could this be the powder keg that catapults us into World War III?"
I see more headlines. I just saw one this morning on Twitter from Bloomberg about China and America potentially heading towards World War III than I do about Russia. Although I will, so I think maybe that might be a better question for the next topic. But of course, we need to handle these things seriously. Human lives are at stake whenever you have these kind of incidents. It doesn't matter if it leads to World War III or not. It simply matters whether or not somebody gets killed. And as for whether it would start World War III, I think that depends on if that leads to actual war. I know that Ukraine has gone on high alert since this. They're terrified of the prospect that Russia might invade. I don't think that they will. I don't see how that would benefit Russia at this point. They have gotten what they more or less want. The ethnic Russians are either part of the Russian Federation now, or they are in these little, although fighting for their survival in a civil war, these little semi-autonomous seceding republics in the east, which may or may not go on to join the Russian Federation later. But even if it did, let's go ahead and hypothetically say Russia did invade the Ukraine. I'm not entirely, I think it would depend on how foolish the United States' leadership was. But historically, despite talking big game in Eastern Europe, I'm not entirely sure the U.S. would do anything. I would certainly hope that President Trump or whomever would demonstrate the same restraint that President Eisenhower displayed during the Prague Spring and the I believe it was Hungary or maybe it was Bulgaria. I'm not sure which one of those. When they attempted to break out of the Eastern Bloc in the 1950s and the Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the uprising, that was in Russia's sphere of influence. America didn't do anything. So I would hope that that level of restraint and common sense could prevail. But that's assuming that Russia would even attack, which, as I mentioned, there's no real reason for them to at this point, and they would gain nothing from it. So
I see.
I'll say no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I mean that kind of handles that whole situation in a nutshell with Russia, even though it's still very complex. But
I think we handled it pretty good with our time constraints tonight. It's probably a good time to move on to the next topic with the time.
So I would next ask you, speaking of China, what's going on there? That was a topic I know you wanted to bring up, so let's kind of segue into that. What's this whole trade deal with China that you mentioned?
That's Gabe. I believe you're putting your.
Okay. I was going to see if you had anything there, Josh.
No, I thought you were going to lead us into that one.
Well, I can lead us into that. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot to it in recent events, at least, other than and this dives into Trump attending the G20 summit. But during the summer. And earlier in the year, Trump had threatened to levy tariffs against China. And so he had levied a 10% tariff on, I think it was like $12 billion in Chinese goods. And it was in response to the criticisms of China in terms of the way they're handling their economy, currency manipulation, basically subsidizing their industry so it's an unlevel playing field. While since the U.S. Is a member of the G20, it doesn't have those same requirements. So Trump had threatened to levy tariffs. He did, but a couple months ago or a few months ago, Trump had promised, or I shouldn't say promised, but he had threatened to actually levy a 25% tariff on all Chinese goods over worth $200 billion. And so in response, China did well, if you do that, we'll do that too. And it was coming due that that those tariffs were going to have to be implemented or not implemented because Trump kind of gave a self-imposed deadline. And Trump announced after the G20 summit that those tariffs were basically going to be held off while China and the U.S. Engaged in some conversations about trade and tariffs. And the main criticism of China, especially on the trade front, I mean, beyond just the politics of it, is that while China's economy has grown exponentially in the last 10 or 20 years, there hasn't been a corresponding growth with many of the nations that are their trade partners. And whether that be the EU or the US, which are China's two biggest trade partners, the two nations in the way that the two, I should say, the US and then the EU as an entity and China, they have very diametrically opposed views in terms of trade. So for example, the West view on trade or something like intellectual property rights will be, well, if you made it, you get to keep it. In China, you don't get to keep what you make. And so
Right.
what that means for a lot of domestic developers say here is if you develop a property here, but you sell it overseas in China, the government gets to have whatever you made, and you don't get to say whether they give it to a Chinese company and they copy you or not. And so it's just created an unlevel playing field, and it's become more apparent under Trump that he's willing to call China out, and actually larger businesses in the U.S. are willing to start calling China out, knowing that they finally have a president who is at least willing to say what they're doing.
Well, I mean, I certainly know that one thing that I read earlier this week, tech investors are flipping out because these tariffs may affect Foxconn, which is the manufacturer of the of basically the news media always likes to phrase that these tariffs could affect Apple, because of the iPhone and whatnot. But in reality, it would not only affect Apple, it would affect basically the entire tech industry of both, Apple, Samsung, and Google, who they all use Foxconn, which is basically the manufacturer in China to physically build these phones. So I know that these tariffs have really made the tech investors really nervous because of that.
They have, and I mean, there's obviously a political component to why Trump didn't do it. I think levying, say, a 10% tariff on $10 billion in goods, primarily agricultural products, is one thing, but levying a 25% tariff on $200 billion worth of goods, knowing that China is going to reciprocate, is going to have ripple effects through the entire economy. I think it's more important, though, that Trump is making it clear, and he's made it clear for a couple of years, of the message finally of we're not going to put up with your shit anymore. And that, I mean, pardon my French, but that is essentially what Trump has done. And his backing off the tariffs doesn't necessarily indicate there's going to be a change in policy, because Trump can go back the next day and keep calling out China on what they're doing. What it basically is in a nutshell, it's a West versus East outlook on how to grow your economy and how economies should be run. And I say a West versus East thing only because China is not unusual in how it's growing its economy and how it manages its economy. A lot of Asian countries were command and control economies because the state sponsored the companies and the industries until they grew enough that the state didn't really have to protect them, but those industries still have built-in protections. So if you think about it like Korean car manufacturers, Hyundai, they didn't get started the same way American car companies did. They got started under a much more protected and subsidized industry. And if it weren't for those subsidies, those companies wouldn't be in existence right now. And in the same way, China has modeled after that, and the West has much more of a Josh, what do you call it?
Liberal.
Well, liberal on
I know.
economics, but the West has a much more not laissez-faire, but a much more uh, I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of, but it's much more of a sink or swim kind of mentality with companies and more opening to
Startup.
trade. Um, and
That startup mentality comes to mind. I don't know.
right, yeah, exactly. And so for a long time, China and the U.S. have kind of been symbiotic in their rise, and for a long time it was assumed that whatever helps China helps the U.S. and it helps the EU. What we're now seeing is that that's not true anymore, and that China's economic rise is starting to come at the expense of Western companies and Western industries.
Well, not only that, but I think also there is, if you're the dominant economic, I'll put it this way. So the US has what we would call cultural imperialism, right? You have the big companies that make a huge impact, almost completely supplanting the culture and values in other countries. So if China were to become the dominant economic power, isn't there also a legitimate fear that Chinese values, for example, the crackdown on religion that Xi is going on right now, isn't there some fear that that might become more widespread? The long arm of Beijing might reach out and say, "Hey, look, if you're going to do business with us, you have to do things our way," kind of.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, it's funny that you mentioned that because I can't remember whether you were on my podcast when we talked about this or whether or not this was on one of the AW podcasts. But I remember a few months ago we were talking about like culture and Hollywood and whatnot, and I mentioned that one of the reasons why we're seeing so many reboots and so many just bad movies in general that skew so far to the social justice, left isn't only because of Hollywood here, but also because so many of these big movie franchises now are now directly appealing to the Asian market and more specifically to Chinese investors who own like big shares in Disney and all of these other companies. And this isn't Alex Jones conspiracy theory stuff either. You can actually look this up and see that at, in lots of the entertainment companies, a lot of them have heavy investing, at least internationally, by China. So it's interesting that you say that they could, be a big influence just because I think you're already starting to see that a bit, at least in the film industry.
Well, I know for a fact it's happening in the European Union because the European Union used to always present itself, hypocritically or not, depending on what region of the world we're talking about. But they used to, European Court of Human Rights, for example, used to come out and criticize China on a regular basis. But since Xi Jinping has rolled out his Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to have a lot more continental trade with the EU, they're building a series of highways throughout Asia and Russia and into Europe, a new Silk Road kind of, except without the drugs. If anybody gets that joke,
Yeah,
but
I did.
Yeah.
anyways, they're since she's launched his initiative, the European Union has all but gone silent. They've not said a word about the massive persecution of Christians and Muslims throughout China.
Well, and China now has that new social um, credit system that they're slowly starting to roll out.
Well, and I think that for the something like the social credit system, I think that in itself is very it really shows the divide in terms of culture between the two societies. Where, and you can see this in the films that China makes. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese film companies have been putting out movies together for years, and every single Chinese film is much more. It's much more about national unity. It's about national pride. And I mean, it goes, for those of us who grew up on Western movies, we kind of look at it and we're like, are you serious? Like, there's a Jet Li movie, and literally it's all about the state and protecting the nation and the country. And it's very nationalistic in its presentation and the feeling of the movie. You don't see many of those in Western media when it's made for a Western audience.
No.
Can I get in one question for you real quick, Gabe, as we get into because we didn't really mention this yet, and I thought we were going to get into it. But didn't Trump also sign a new trade deal with Canada and Mexico?
He did, yes. So, and that actually links with China a little bit in that it was inked at the G20 summit. It does still need to be approved through Congress. But I don't know all the technical details of it, but perhaps the biggest one was in regards to the auto industry and how it now requires that for the U.S. at least, for a car to be sold in the U.S. From either Mexico or Canada, 65% of it has to be produced in the U.S. And then there are other details. There is the U.S. gets more access to Canadian dairy, which until this started, I didn't actually know that Canadian dairy was a huge issue for the U.S. And also there are rules in there that 40% of labor, 40% of the labor that goes into cars sold in the U.S. has to pay at $16 or more. And then there are other details as well. It's on the deal will expire in 16 years unless it's reapproved, and it will be re-examined every 6 years. The one big thing that was not included in it was currently there are tariffs still on steel and aluminum, and those were not included in the deal. So that's kind of the biggest thing that did not come out of the deal itself. It's not, from my understanding of it, and I'm not a trade wonk per se, and I haven't dug into it, it's not that much of an improvement over NAFTA. But what I think, again, it is trade deals, even if they're not perfect, being willing to be re-examined.
So here's my question I wanted to ask you about that now that we're on the topic. Excuse me. Mexico's new president was just sworn in yesterday. I forget his full name, but I'll call him by his popular nickname, AMLO. And as I understand it, if Trump is, if this guy is so he's against free trade to such an extent that he makes Trump look like a globalist. And so the understanding I have is he's not too excited about the deal. Do you think, first off, can the Mexican president just unilaterally say, "Oh, I quit"? And second, what do you think? What impact do you think that's going to have on it going forward?
I would probably say not much, only in the sense of, I mean, technically, Canada or Mexico can walk away from the deal at any time, or can walk away from NAFTA if they wanted to right now, but the ripple effects in their economies would be massive. For example, I mean, it's true, the trade deal, NAFTA, or this trade deal, has been incredibly beneficial to Mexico. because they have access to American goods. American companies are in Mexico. If you think of like the car manufacturers, there are American auto manufacturing facilities in Mexico. There are Japanese and Korean car maker facilities in Mexico, and they're there because they get NAFTA deals. If 90% of a vehicle is made in Mexico, and it's say it's Subaru or Mazda, which is just Japanese car company. If that vehicle is made in Mexico and shipped to the U.S., it's tariff free. But the benefit for Mexico is that they're good, high paying jobs. So I mean, I have a sense with the new Mexican president. I mean, I don't exactly know fully what he believes. I think he's a lot more bark than bite. And I think if he walked away from the trade deal, it would have a lot of damaging effects on his country. I think he's more like Trump in the sense of that he will criticize deals that he doesn't think are fair or deals that are made 30 years ago and everybody's still following them more than just ripping them up and walking away.
This doesn't perhaps necessarily need to be said, but just to give you an idea of where he is, I watched his campaign, and he is a friend. He is personal friends with Jeremy Corbyn. His wife either used to or still does work at Russia Today, and he was criticized heavily by American liberals because even though he did the Bernie Sanders kind of song and dance on economics, he was pretty he was either ambiguous or he was outright socially conservative when he was asked about social justice and identity kind of issues.
Isn't he also the guy, Josh, if I'm not mistaken, who said that Trump was right on the whole migrant thing? I remember
He did. His very first action as president, which I've praised him for, is he has signed a pledge to try and they're not going to be allowing migrants to just work their way through Mexico or to just be pouring in across their southern border to get to ours, or they're going to also enforce their end of the their northern border. And I've praised that because his position on it appears to be the same as mine and Jeremy Corbyn's, which is that a lot of these countries are economically down, they're downscale, and so the workers there are more or less made to be modern day wage slaves being shipped abroad in order to work for the wealthy who don't want to pay their own people a decent wage.
Mm-hmm.
So I praise him for that.
Well, and it's also keeping his country safe, and by extension ours safe from all of these potential drug lords who are coming across as well.
That said, we are approaching our last 3-minute mark, so I guess Sam, how do you want us to? What are your closing questions or thoughts for Gabe or I?
Well, I mean, I can't really think of any. I guess my question for Josh regarding the Canadian, Mexico deal is, do you think it's a good deal, bad deal, or has not enough time passed for you to form an opinion on it? I didn't really get a clear sense of that when you were talking about it.
I think you meant Gabe.
Yeah, Gabe.
Oh wait. Oh, you mean do I think it's a good or bad deal, or is this a question for Josh, Sam?
Both of you actually, but I'll start with you, Gabe.
I will say it's not a bad deal. I don't know yet if it is a good deal. I mean, keep in mind it's not ratified yet. It has to go through Congress. There are some things in it that I know of that sort of give me pause. I don't think this is a bad deal, but I don't think it's a significant improvement over NAFTA. But what I do think is good about it is it does signal to the world that we don't just do free trade and we don't just do trade agreements for trade agreements' sake. It actually has to benefit us. And we will revisit trade agreements that we believe don't benefit us. And may honestly put us at a disadvantage. So I think if I had to say, I would say it's good from that perspective.
I don't know the details of this agreement near as much as Gabe, so I'm going to say that I'm a wait and see on it as well. I will say that I was adamantly against NAFTA because of the impact it had on American workers. So I'm glad that they at least revisited that. Whether the new one or not is good, I guess, or good or not, we'll wait and see. I would generally agree, though, with Gabe's closing assessment that we shouldn't be doing trade deals just for the sake of having trade deals. They have to actually benefit American workers and the American people.
I would agree with both of you on that. I mean, I really I personally I'm not as much of a policy wonk, but I know when it comes to new sort of law, I don't really like to have or legislation. I don't really like to have an opinion it's um until it's ratified and put into action because up until that point everything is theoretical and on paper only. So with all that in mind, gentlemen, I know that next week we're going to be canceling the podcast for sure because I have I have final exams for college next week. But I think did we also plan to go on hiatus or have we not decided on
So for our listeners here, to quickly close us out, we were discussing whether or not we might take a Christmas hiatus and come back with a New Year episode. I don't think we've determined that yet, but if you would stay posted with us on, we're going to make that decision sometime here. I would say within the next few days, and follow us on our social media on Facebook or Twitter, and we will either post our decision there, or maybe Sam might have one not next week, but a podcast or a message or something the week after, letting you all know if we're on break or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think if we do, I think for now we should just say that we're going to cancel next week's episode. If we do go on hiatus, I think we should maybe have like one final mini episode to kind of do like a 2018 wrap up. And if we do, we'll announce all that in the future. So again, keep up with our social media. That's American Watchman on Facebook and at A_Watchman on Twitter is where you can find us on Twitter. So, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the American Watchman Roundtable. And good night, God bless, and God save this great nation.